question that Ozzy's asking. He says, oh, why are there so many contradictions in the Bible? And in particular, one could cite maybe some of the accounts that we find in the Gospels. They're not always the same. The wording is not exactly the same. How do we explain these, what seems to be contradictions?
Well, I'm glad you qualified that, because I used to say, yeah, there's contradictions in the Bible. And the more I studied, I realized that there are what you would call apparent contradictions. For example, above the head of Jesus, I mentioned last night in our message on the thief on the cross, there was a sign, and Pilate had the sign. It had said, "This is the King of the Jews." Well, when you go to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, every one of the Gospels has the wording on the sign a little different. One will say, he said he was the King of the Jews, Jesus Nazareth, King of the Jews, and they're all different. Someone says, so you can't really trust the Bible. They can't even get the wording on the sign correctly. They forget that the words on the sign, it says it was in 3 languages. So they had it in Hebrew, they had it in Greek, they had it in Latin, and so it just depends on which wording, and the disciples probably all spoke a little bit of elementary Hebrew, Greek, Latin, and Aramaic. It just depended on what version they were translating. It was up there 3 times, so that's not a contradiction. There are times in the Bible where it'll say there were 2 blind men on the road by Jericho, and one time it says there was a blind man named Bartimaeus, and they said, well, was it 2 blind men or 1 blind man? That's a contradiction. Not really. It means that maybe one was more outspoken, and he spoke up. And so one recorded this blind man, the one who spoke. There were actually 2 there, but only one spoke, named Bartimaeus. And so that, for me, actually affirms the Bible. That tells you that the Bible writers did not make these things up. It's like, it's pretty common when a lot of people witness an event, depending on the perspective of where they were standing, they will relate the event based on what their perspective was of how they heard it and saw it. And so, you know, I think that, and if you take what they call apparent contradictions, you're talking about 1/10 of 1% of the Bible. 99.9 of the Bible, you're going to see incredible unity.
You know, another point to add to that, which seemed to help me when I'm reading the different gospel accounts, when you're reading what Jesus says, he might give a parable a certain way in one of the gospels, but then it's different in another gospel. What we need to recognize is that Jesus traveled to a number of towns and villages, and of course his disciples with him. And Jesus probably told some of the same parables to new audiences. Of course, the disciples heard that. I know, Pastor Doug, you often, and myself as well, will preach the same sermon in different situations. Rarely do we use the exact same words, even though we're telling the same story or making the same point. So I think some of the disciples might have been impressed by a particular way Jesus said something, and they remembered it that way at one place. But maybe Jesus said it a little differently when he was in a different town or village, and they recorded it that way. So these slight variations in what Jesus said, it doesn't mean that the Bible is contradicting itself, rather that Jesus told the same thing in different locations.
Absolutely. I always feel sorry for Mrs. Batchelor and you, because we've traveled a lot and done a lot of meetings. You probably heard me preach the same sermon many times, but it's always a little different because of what the circumstances are. I look out in the audience and you see people and you say they may need to hear this or that, and so it's modified. I'm sure Jesus went from town to town. He looked in people's hearts and he shared things differently. And Luke is unique because Luke interviewed people other than the apostles that heard the teachings of Jesus. And so he's got a couple of stories like, you know, Zacchaeus and the prodigal son and things you won't find in any other gospel.
Now, of course, if somebody's looking at the Bible and they're critical of the Bible, there is an aspect of truth that the Bible brings to light in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 14. And we believe Paul wrote this. He says, "But the natural man does not receive the things of the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness to him, nor can he know them because they are spiritually discerned." So it's important when we want to find truth in the Bible, we need to come with the right attitude. We need to come with a willing heart. Jesus said, if you're willing to do the doctrine, then you'll know whether or not it is of God. So there needs to be a willingness to do what God is asking.
Absolutely. You know, in the Old Testament, there's this several references to the stone which the builders rejected. It's in Psalms. And then Jesus says in Matthew 21:42, have you never read? You know how many times Jesus says, have you read, have you read, have you read? Jesus is always saying you need to read. Have you never read in the Scriptures, the stone that the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone? This was the Lord's doing, and it's marvelous in our eyes. By the way, Jesus is making a very good quote there of Psalms, the same way David wrote it. Then Peter later explains in 1 Peter 2, verse 4, coming to him, Jesus, as a living stone, rejected indeed by men, but chosen by God and precious. He says, oh, Jesus is the stone, the foundation stone that was rejected. And so these passages you read in the Old Testament, you sometimes need to read the Bible for a while, and then you'll say, A, B, C. Now it makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So I just looked at 3 scriptures, one in the Old Testament, one where Jesus references it, and then where Peter references that Jesus is the fulfillment of it. And then it all becomes clear. So when it talks about the clarity of the scriptures, sometimes it takes a little time to bring that all together.